Hello friends. Today in this tutorial we are going to see the complete process of RCM, that is reverse charge mechanism in Marg ERP software. Normally when you purchase goods and services from an unregistered supplier and that supplier is not registered under GST, so you are liable for reverse charge. Means the tax that is applied on the goods and services that you have purchased from unregistered supplier, that much amount of tax has to be paid by you to the government. There are some new updates from the government in reverse charge mechanism, according to which reverse charge will be applicable in 3 cases. The first case is that if any purchase is being made from unregistered supplier and if the consolidated purchase or expense which is being done per day exceeds rupees 5,000, then reverse charge is applicable on it. Second case is if any kind of goods or services is being taken from an e-commerce site, then reverse charges will be applicable on it. Third case is if any goods or services which is already being defined by the government, that reverse charge is applicable on them, whether it is being purchased from registered or unregistered suppliers, then reverse charge would be applicable on those goods and services, whether they are being purchased from registered or unregistered suppliers. For example, services taken from advocates, services taken for transportation, sponsorship services, etc. Now let's discuss in detail what is GST reversal and in which cases GST reversal is applicable. If you purchase any goods or services which the government has defined under not eligible for input tax credit, then GST reversal is applicable on them. Second, if you are purchasing goods for your personal use, then GST reversal is applicable on them. Third, if you are selling taxable goods along with exempted goods, then GST reversal is applicable on exempted goods. In the first case, if you are purchasing goods or services from a registered supplier, that is those goods or services which the government has defined under not eligible for input tax credit, then GST reversal is applicable on them. In simple terms, there are some goods or services defined by the government on which no input tax credit is applicable, even if you have done tax payment for them. For example, food and beverages, beauty parlor services, construction of immovable properties, etc. Suppose you are purchasing food and beverages from a registered restaurant and the owner of the restaurant has given you the bill along with the tax amount. Then you have to pay the total tax amount, but you will not be eligible for the input tax credit. In this case, GST reversal is applicable where you are paying the tax but you are not getting any input tax credit. So GST reversal would be added in your expenses. In the second case, if you are purchasing goods for your personal use, then in that case GST reversal is applicable on them. For example, if you are purchasing headphone along with the mobile phone and you use mobile for official purpose and headphone for personal, then you will get input tax credit for the tax which you pay for mobile. But you will not get any input tax credit for the purchase of headphone. Third case is, if you sell taxable goods along with exempted goods, then GST reversal would be applicable for exempted goods only. Third case is, if you sell taxable goods along with exempted goods, then GST reversal would be applicable for only exempted goods. Now let's see the implementation of RCM in Marg ERP software. If you go on Masters, Ease of GST adoption, then enter on reverse charge on expenses, then you will find a list of all the expenses ledgers. Suppose here there is a ledger office expenses. If we press enter on it, then you will find 4 options: not applicable, daily basis, compulsory and GST reversal. Not applicable means on which the reverse charge is not applicable. The user can view the list of RCM exempted here. If you do any expenses that are specified here, then against those expenses you will select not applicable. Suppose if you have made an expense ledger of salary and wages, then you will select not applicable against that ledger. Next is daily basis. Daily basis means the expense which are based on daily limit. So if this expense is based on daily limit, then you will set this to daily limit. The expenses which are being made in a day plus all the other expenses made that are liable for RCM, if the total amount of all these expenses exclude rupees 5,000, then the user needs to deposit RCM. And if the total amount does not exceed 5,000 rupees, then no RCM deposit needs to be made. This means this condition is applicable on those expenses which the user will set as daily basis. Next is compulsory. If any goods or service are being purchased either from registered or unregistered supplier which the government has defined on which goods or services reverse charge would be applicable, then the reverse charge would be applicable on the purchase of those goods or services whether it has been taken from a registered or unregistered supplier. For example, services taken from advocates, goods transport services, sponsorship services, etc. Here you can see there is a list of reverse charge compulsory. These are the list of services and these are the list of goods. So if you have created any expense ledger for any of these expenses, so you will set compulsory against them. Next is GST reversal. The government has defined some goods and services on which input tax credit would not be received, even if you have paid tax for them. For example, if the user takes services from beauty parlor which is registered and he has included the tax in the invoice, then the user will pay the tax, but the user will not be liable for the input tax credit. You can see a list of all the goods and services which come under GST reversal. So if any of these expense ledgers are created which are shown under GST reversal, so you will set those expense ledger to GST reversal. As for now, let's set this office expenses to daily basis. So in this way you will set RCM type for all the other expenses. The user can set RCM type for the supplier's ledgers also. For example, we have created a ledger of our restaurant from where we order food and beverages. In ledger detail, as you can see, we have mentioned the GSTIN of this restaurant and we have set GST reversal in ledger type. Similarly, if you take compulsory expenses from this ledger, so you will set ledger type to RCM compulsory. Now since we only take the services of compulsory expenses from this ledger, that is why we have set the ledger type of this supplier as GST reversal. Now let's see how MargERP software works when a user makes a purchase entry. Firstly, Mark software sees from the GSTIN number from the supplier's ledger that whether the user is purchasing goods or services from a registered supplier or an unregistered supplier. If the user is purchasing goods or services from a registered supplier, then the software will see that the goods or services, that is whether the expenses which the user is making, is categorized under compulsory expenses or GST reversal expenses. If the user takes services from a registered advocate, and it is already been discussed that the advocate expenses is categorized under compulsory expenses, so reverse charge would be applicable on them. That is, if the user does compulsory expenses, then the software will create a reverse charge entry against it. The entry which the user will enter, for that input tax credit would also be applicable. The amount which is paid as reverse charge to the government, the same amount the user will get in return as input tax credit. If the user is making any expense that is not categorized under compulsory expenses, then the software will see that whether those expenses are categorized under GST reversal expenses. If the purchase of the user is categorized under GST reversal expenses, for example beauty services, that is the tax which is being paid for that, the user would not be liable for the input tax credit in this case. When the user will create a GST reversal expense entry, then the tax which would be added along with it, the software will automatically do the entry for reverse charge for that. Now if the user is purchasing goods or services from an unregistered supplier, then the software will see that the goods or services, that is whether the expense which the user is making, is categorized under compulsory expenses or daily expenses. If the user does an expense which is categorized under compulsory expenses, then RCM would be applicable and the user would also be liable for input tax credit. If the expenses is not categorized under compulsory expenses, then it is categorized under daily basis. But in this case, there is a condition which is defined along with it. The condition says that the expense which is done, then along with that expense, the other expenses for that one day should exceed Rs 5,000. So when the daily expenses exceed Rs 5,000, then the software will generate a reverse entry in this case, and also the user will be liable for input tax credit. In MargERP software, you can do purchase entry either from the transaction menu, from the purchase option, or from the GST inward option, or from the accounts menu. If you want to do the entries in inventory formats, then you will do the entry from the transaction menu. And if you want to do the purchase entries in accounting format, so you will do those entries from the accounts menu. As you are already aware that the purchase is done in two ways, expense purchase and second goods purchase. The bill which the user receives, against that particular bill GST is charged or GST is not charged. On one hand, if the user does expenses and on that particular bill GST is not being charged, then the user will make that entry by accounts menu, either by payment option or through journal option. If the user is purchasing goods and the supplier has not charged GST at the time of generating the bill, then the user will make the entry either by going to purchase option from accounts menu or by going to the purchase option from the transaction menu. On the other hand, if the user has done payment for any expenses on which GST is being charged, then the user will make the entry by going to GST inward option from accounts menu or by going to GST inward option from transaction menu. If the user is purchasing goods on which GST is charged, then the user can do the entry either by going to purchase option from accounts menu or by going to purchase option from transaction menu. In this video, we will work on these transactions. Firstly, we have purchased tea for office staff. Now there is no GST on the bill that the tea vendor has provided us. Now tea expenses neither comes under compulsory expenses nor GST reversal. So in the software, we will set tea and coffee expenses to daily basis and select the HSN of tea and coffee. In the next transaction, we have purchased soap and phenyl for office cleaning purpose. This vendor also has not provided us a bill with GST. Means we have purchased soap and phenyl from an unregistered shopkeeper. So for that, we will go on office expenses and set this to daily basis. Next, we have taken advocate services. Even this advocate has given us a bill without GST. Now advocate services comes under compulsory expenses. So for that, we will go on legal services expense and set this to compulsory and select the HSN of advocate services. Next, we have paid salary and wages on which RCM is not applicable. So for that, we will go on salary and wages expense and set this to not applicable. Next, we have ordered food and beverages from Avkar restaurant. Now the government has specified that if you purchase food and beverages from a registered supplier, so reverse charge will be applicable on it, but you won't get input tax credit for it. So this is a case of GST reversal. Firstly, we will select GST reversal for food and beverages expense. Then select the HSN of food and beverages. Then we have created a ledger Avkar restaurant, in which we have defined the GST IN of this restaurant. Means this is a registered restaurant, and we have set GST reversal in the ledger type. So in this way, we have set RCM type for all expenses. Now let's do the entries of all these and see. Firstly, let's do the entry for tea for office staff. Now since this is an expense invoice on which GST is not charged, so we will do its entry from the accounts menu, from payment option or journal option. Now let's do its entry from the journal option. On debit side, we will select tea and coffee expense. We have done 1000 rupees payment. And on credit side, let's select the ledger of the tea shop. Here you see we have not mentioned the GST IN. Means he is an unregistered vendor. Now let's save this entry. Now let's do the entry of soap and phenyl expenses. Now let's do the entry of this transaction from the payment voucher. On the debit side, we will select office expenses. Suppose we have done a payment of direct 4000 rupees in cash. Let's save this entry. In the next transaction, we have taken advocate services. This is a case of compulsory RCM. Let's do the entry of this transaction from GST inward option. Here you will enter the date of transaction, enter. Then we will select the ledger of the advocate. So this is the ledger of our advocate. Here you see in ledger detail of this advocate, he is an unregistered advocate because we have not mentioned his GSTIN number. In his ledger type, we have set this to RCM compulsory because we do compulsory expenses from him. Now let's select his ledger. Then the window of expenses will appear. From here we will select ledger service from advocate. Software is indicating that you are generating an RCM compulsory entry. Here we have created an expense item where we have set the HSN of this item as advocate services. So let's select this item. Suppose we have done a payment of 1000 rupees. In the next transaction, we have paid wages on which RCM is not applicable. So we will do the entry of this from the payment voucher. On the debit side, we will select salary payable. Then we will save this entry. In the next transaction, we have ordered food and beverages from a registered restaurant who has provided us a bill with GST. Let's do the entry of this transaction from GST inward. Firstly, we will select the ledger of Avkar restaurant. Here you see in ledger detail, we have set GST reversal in the ledger of Avkar restaurant. So we'll select him. Here you will select that whether you are making a local purchase bill or central purchase bill. We are making a local purchase bill. Then you will specify the bill number. Then the expense ledgers window will appear. From here we will select the ledger of food and beverages. Then the window of HSN will appear. Here you have to select that what HSN item have you purchased from this restaurant. Let's select a food HSN and a beverages HSN. So we have ordered for 500 rupees food and 400 rupees beverages. Here you see tax is being calculated because we have purchased food and beverages from a registered restaurant. So in case of registered supplier, they charge tax from us. That's why tax amount is getting calculated. Now let's save this entry. Now in this case, software is asking us, want to generate GST reversal? If you do not want to generate GST reversal entry, then you will select no. And if you want to generate GST reversal entry, then you will select yes. Then escape. So in this way, GST reversal entry has been generated. So you have paid this much amount tax and you won't get its input tax credit. Now let's save this entry. In the next transaction, we have booked hotel for business meeting from that same Avkar restaurant and hotel. In this transaction, we have taken a service from a registered supplier who has charged GST in the bill. And this expense that we are doing neither comes under compulsory nor GST reversal. And since we have booked hotel from a registered hotel, so this is not even a case of daily basis. So that's why this is a case of not applicable. We'll do its entry from GST inward expenses. Firstly, we'll select Avkar restaurant ledger. Then select office expenses ledger. Then select the HSN of the service which we have taken. We have done a payment of 2000 rupees. Then we'll save this entry. Then when the software will ask us want to generate GST reversal, so you will select no. Because in this case, this expense is done from a registered supplier and this expense neither comes under compulsory nor GST reversal. This becomes a normal expense purchase entry. So that is why we will select no and save this entry. Now end of the day, when all your purchase entries will be done, then you will go on GST reverse charge option. Now as you know that if in a particular day your daily expense transaction amount exceeds 5000 rupees, then you will have to pay reverse charge. So firstly you will enter the date of reverse charge, enter. Software is showing us that you have done total expenses of 6000 rupees under daily expenses and you have done total 1000 rupees expenses on compulsory expenses. To do its reverse entry, we'll enter on it. The ones that are already ticked are compulsory expenses. So we have to do reverse entry of all of these. So let's select all of these. Enter. So the summary of all the expenses have appeared. These expenses that you have done through payment or journal, the HSN code mentioned in its ledger, and the entry that you have done in GST inward, the HSN code that you had defined there, according to that, this summary has appeared. You can view this summary and make changes if you want. Then press escape. So in this way, a consolidated reverse entry has been generated. You have to pay total this much amount as reverse charge to the government. And because these were compulsory and daily expenses, that is why you will get its input tax credit. Now let's save this entry. In Marg ERP software, there is a provision for RCM in control room. For that, you will go on control room and search for RCM. Now what we did was, whatever daily and compulsory expenses we did today, we generated a consolidated reverse charge entry for all of them at the end of the day. But if you want that after every entry, software asks you for reverse entry, means do you want to do reverse entry or not, then you will set this to 2. Even if by mistake you select no for reverse charge, so at the end of the day when you will do reverse charge entry, then a list of those entries will appear whose reverse charge you have not generated. So software sees to it that reverse charge entry is done for all the daily and compulsory expenses. If you want that the software asks you for reverse charge entry only after compulsory expense entry, then you will set this to 3. If you want that software asks for reverse charge only when you do entry from the transaction menu, then you will set this to 4. For now, we'll let this be 1. You can go on final reports and view GST reverse charge report. Here you will specify the date whose reverse charge you want to view. Here you can see you have done this much amount expenses on daily basis and this much amount expenses on compulsory expenses. And you have charged GST reverse on this much amount. As soon as you will enter, you can view more details. If you want to view the report of only charged reverse entry, then you will enter on charged. And if you only want to view the details of expenses, then you will enter on expenses. So these are all our expenses. You can further enter on this and view the voucher as well. So friends, in this way we learned the complete process of reverse charge mechanism in Marg software. Thanks for watching.